Welcome back. This is week 4, lecture 1, Competing Hierarchies. And this lecture follows very naturally upon the previous one on manorialism and feudalism, because again, we're talking here about the structures of Christendom, the basic structures of Christendom in this first part of the course, to set the foundation for our understanding of the High and Late Middle Ages. And this competing, conflicting hierarchies sets the political tensions for the entire Middle Ages. Now, this too it gets at the issue of how do we describe the Middle Ages? Was it an age of faith or an age of reason? Which is, again, is the central question for this course in many ways. And what do those terms mean? But this lecture shows that there was always tension. Because if Christendom, as I defined it before, was a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship, the question then became who ruled Christendom? Who ruled Christendom? Often, this is put into the context of the so-called conflict or even crisis of church and state. That is a very modern concept that is then read back into the Middle Ages. I think I've said it before, but if not, I should have, but I'll say it here now, and I'll probably say it again several times. Throughout the Middle Ages, there was never a conflict between church and state. There was a conflict, and indeed at times a crisis, between lay power and ecclesiastical power, or between temporal power and spiritual power. The issue was both sides. Let's say the lay imperial side, as I'll explain more later or shortly, and the ecclesiastical side, the clergy. There's clergy and lay people. That's what's going on in terms of the power struggles. They both define, and they were theorists on both sides. That's the whole point. And the theorists on both sides define the church the same way in its most fundamental structures. That is, as a community of the faithful, communio fidelium. The term ecclesia in Latin, or then in Greek, ekklesion, was a pre-Christian term, as I think I did have mentioned, definitely. That simply meant the assembly, or the gathered group, or the called out group. And for Christendom, that was everybody. So everybody consisted of the church, except for, again, the Jews, or the heretics, or the infidels. So it was never this issue of state and church. We're talking about the Christian empire, keep in mind, the Imperium Christianum, the continuation of Rome, which after Theodosius, 391 to 394, Christianity was the only legal religion of Rome. It was a Christian state. That continued, at least in the ideal, continued. So if you'd asked Charlemagne or anybody throughout the Middle Ages saying, tell me about the conflict or the crisis between church and state, they would have said, what are you talking about? First of all, the concept of state is a modern concept, and there have been scholars who have written about the emergence of the early modern state, and I do that too. And in terms of the Reformation class that I teach and the transformations of the 16th century, one of the things I talk about is this transformation, just as we have the transformation from the myth of Rome to the myth of Christendom. So in the origins and development and emergence of early modern Europe, we have the transition from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. But for this course, throughout this course, that our modern concept of state cannot historically be applied to the developments of the time. The question is, how was Christendom governed? Who ruled it? Who had the final say? And how did this all work together between this power struggle between clerics, or the clergy, and the laity? And again, laity is a term that simply means not ordained, not part of the clergy. So in this sense, everyone was either part of the clergy or part of the laity. Now, there were some areas of fusion and overlap and grayness, and I think I already mentioned in terms of talking about the monasteries and the Benedictine monasteries and how the dispensations had to be made so that a monk who technically, legally, was a lay person, not ordained, could become ordained to serve their own monastery. So there's all types of interactions, and the emperor and the government as such, different structures and kings and princes and so viewed themselves as ruling for God. And that's clear with Charlemagne. Talk about the capitularies, the Lord Emperor, the Lord. That connection with that term. How do we understand the conflicts? And in some ways, and this too is applying modern terms to the developments of the medieval past. But it's not a conflict of church and state. The conflict was Christendom a church state, or was it a state church? Now, it would probably be best just to not use the term state to apply to the Middle Ages. But it's the lay power and the lay governing power as opposed to the ecclesiastical governing power. And these were competing hierarchies. And that is what I want to try to delineate for you today, because this was one of the central structures and institutional structures of Christendom, which again was a myth, because there was no such thing that was Christendom. There were such things as bishops and princes and kings and emperors and popes. How did they relate? That's what we're getting at. And if there was, if the Pope said one thing and the Emperor said another, how was that resolved? Because in some ways, both the Pope and the Emperor were the Supreme Court. I mean, in our American system, at least theoretically, I'm not going to talk about the actual practice, but the theory behind it all is that the Supreme Court is the final court of appeal. It's the final say, because once the Supreme Court determines what the Constitution means in terms of its application, that is final, at least until the Supreme Court overturns a previous precedent, as is said. But within medieval Christendom, both the emperor and the pope were the Supreme Court. There was like two Supreme Courts. Now, our Supreme Court, we know there's all kinds of conflicts. Is it a 5-4 decision? Is it a 6-3 decision? Or is it, rarely is it a unanimous decision? And in so many ways, the same with the Pope and the Emperor. The Pope here, not only the Pope, because underneath the Pope, we have archbishops and bishops, and not everyone just allied with the Pope. And underneath the Emperor, we have kings and dukes and counts. So there was conflict within those hierarchies themselves. But it became a real struggle for how do we govern ourselves? What does it mean? Who has the final say? And if there are competing final says, there's no one further up to appeal to except for God. So that kind of provides, I hope, the structure to see the tensions and the inherent conflicts that at times broke out into serious crises in almost open warfare. Indeed, as we'll see in the later Middle Ages, indeed open warfare, where the Pope went to war against the Emperor. But to understand that, we need to see kind of the basic understandings and structures behind it and what led to that, what made that possible. Because beginning around the year 1000, we can see increasing conflict between the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy, the Pope and the Emperor. And it is wrong to see that as church and state. Now, the ecclesiastical hierarchy did define the church as the communio fidelium, as the community of believers, of the faithful. But it also said we can also understand the church with the Latin phrase pars pro toto, apart for the whole, as being the clergy. So there were these almost competing definitions. Is the church the communio fidelium, the community of all the faithful, or is it the clergy? And the clerical side, the ecclesiastical side, said it's both. But we can talk about it, pars pro toto, the clergy for everybody. But then that can be a conflict too, because of course the imperial side or the lay side of it all was like, no, we're talking about the proprietary church. Remember, this is my church. I rule for God. And this is my church and it's my responsibility. And I'm going to have to answer to God. Pope and bishops and priests would say, yeah, we have to answer to God too. When we die, we're going to be asked about how we did our job. So there is that inherent tension of we are both given a task. We know from Romans and Paul saying the powers that be are ordained of God. Clearly, there are political powers in the world that were known too that were not Christian. But even there, the powers that be are ordained of God. As Jesus told Pilate, you have power over me, yes, because God has given it to you. So it was God's ordained power that was in play in terms of being able to crucify Jesus. Jesus says, yeah, I could have gotten out of it if I'd wanted to, but this is God's ordained plan. So it becomes very messy. And I don't want it to be reduced to, oh, this was a conflict of church and state. Ha, 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 ha. That's not what was going on in any way, shape, or form. It's a conflict within the power structures of Christendom, because both sides, so to speak, accepted this ideal of the Christian empire. Pure and simple. Who's in charge of the Christian empire? Once it becomes a Christian empire, how do we understand those inherent conflicts? There was no real solution. Both the imperial side, or the lay side, and the ecclesiastical side, or the papal side, had their own solutions. But there was, again, no higher authority to which to appeal. So there's this inherent tension and conflict. We'll see too later on in this course that one of the political theorists for the emperor, Marcellus Apagio, in the 14th century, argued that the papacy should be abolished. But we'll get there when we get there. Now, from this point, I just want to look at the structures. Go through them quickly. And so we turn first to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. If you turn to this first slide here, we have God, the Pope, brackets, college of cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, and people. Now, we see this clearly as a hierarchy. No one within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, including the Pope, no one ever said that God was not the head of the church. God was always the head of the church. Jesus was the head of the church. The Pope, as it developed, and as the papal theory developed, I already talked about, Gregory the Great and the Petrine Doctrine, as I referred to that. There's earlier versions too, and I'll be talking about some of those. That we have this concept of what does it mean to rule for God? What does it mean to rule for God? How do we put those two together? My kingdom is not of this world. Satan is the prince of the world. And indeed, Augustine argued, and other people did too, that the whole function of government, all government, whether it was Christian or not, was to refrain human sin. Because in heaven, there will be no government. God will be all in all. There won't be kings and princes and popes and bishops in heaven. All of those offices will stop, will cease, will go away. It'll just be people and God. And there is the ultimate rulership, the ultimate lordship is God in heaven. And that idea then becomes, how do we translate that within temporality when we're not yet in heaven? It's always been argued too that it was, from Augustine on, that if Adam and Eve had not sinned, there would be no government. Lions would frolic around with lambs instead of now eating them and everything else. That original sin, in Augustinian's terms, screwed everything up. We wouldn't have had mosquitoes. Or if we had mosquitoes, they wouldn't be sucking our blood or anybody else's blood. Things like that. All of nature fell because of that. These are concepts that, to understand the medieval mind, we need to really struggle to grasp, because it is the way they viewed things in the world. And yet, within that context of this fallen humanity and fallen nature, the fall of creation, how do we go about doing things? That was the question. If the powers that be are ordained of God, what are those powers and how do they act? And here with the ecclesiastical side, we have it in a hierarchy, which is almost just a natural human way of thinking. Because God is at the top, no question. No one else is God. But there has to be an authoritative structure. The Pope, and I've talked about this a little bit before, in Latin it's just Papa, which means father, but the Bishop of Rome became the primate of the West. There was conflict between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch and the Archbishop of Constantinople in Constantinople. I'll be talking more about that when we get there, in terms of the official split, the so-called Great Schism of 1054. And there was competition between the Pope and the Eastern powers, again, the Patriarch and the Archbishop of Constantinople, between who really ruled between those two. But when we look at Europe and Christendom as seen as this originally Frankish Christian empire, then we can understand that on the ecclesiastical side, the Pope is at the head of it. The Pope crowned Charlemagne. The Pope, from the Pope's side of things, created the emperor, just as all powers that be are ordained of God, therefore all powers that be are ordained by the Pope in their mind, in its mind. Because the Pope functions as the administrator for God within temporality on earth. Now, you can agree with that or disagree with it. That's not the point. As I've said before, historically, the point is not to say, did this really happen? Was this really the case? Is this really the truth? Historical truth is based on the evidence and what people thought at the time. Historians don't, or they shouldn't, even though they sometimes often do, talk about the truth, capital T. Historical truth is what can be stated based on the evidence and defended based on the evidence. How do we come to understand the world through their eyes? Not judging them, but first to understand it. That's what we're getting at. Now we can sit back and judge them, but then that's not an historical judgment. It's an individual judgment. I could easily say, okay, I'm an atheist, and it's all wrong. It's all kind of ridiculous superstition. Or I could say I'm a Muslim, and Christianity is wrong, and we should have been put down. Blah 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 blah. Or I'm Jewish, and Christianity is wrong. Or I'm Christian, and Islam and Judaism are wrong. Or I'm Buddhist, and they're all wrong. Those are issues of theology or philosophy, not of history. Even though each of those philosophies and theologies and religions, including atheism as a religion, but that's kind of another issue in some ways, all have their historical developments and roots. And in the past, they're all trying to assert the truth. That process is kind of ongoing, yes, but the historian is in a situation where we have to step back and try to observe it from outside. Now, that is impossible, as I've argued. Everybody is biased. Everyone has a bias, which is simply the point of observation. But the point is to recognize that. And if I come at all of this and say, well, I know what the truth is, and so that's how I'm going to, interpret all this and judge the past because, I know the truth. They don't. That's not a historical interpretation. It's a philosophical or theological interpretation, which is distinct from historical. I'm not saying that's not a valid approach to it, but it's not an historical approach. That's what we need to focus on. So we have the Pope, and then basically this is just the Roman administrative structure, as I've talked about with Diocletian. Diocletian divided up the empire into east and west, and then further divided it into dioceses, seen ruled or governed by an overseer, or again, the pre-Christian term episcopus became bishop. And we have a hierarchy of bishoprics. So we have archbishops are in charge of an archdiocese. Bishops are in charge of a diocese. Priests are in charge of a parish. And the people are just the people. So the people interact with their priests, their local parish priests, and they're supposed to go to their parish church, which is something also that we've gotten away from today when we have, church shopping, so to speak, if that means anything to anybody. But it used to be that you had to go to your parish church. And the parish church was part of the diocese. So there'd be many different parishes within a diocese. And the bishop was in charge of the diocese. And as I've said before, you can't have a bishopric without having a cathedral. And you can't have a cathedral without having a bishop. The cathedral is the bishop's church, and it comes from the term cathedra, or chair. Who sits in the chair of government of a diocese? That's the bishop. But then when we look at larger structures, bishoprics are organized into archdioceses. And just as parishes are organized and structured into a diocese by a bishop, so are bishoprics organized into an archdiocese. In an archdiocese, then they're all under the Pope. Archbishop is an archbishop, a bishop of an archdiocese. And the Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, is over it all. We're going to be talking a lot about the theory, the papal theory there, of what does that mean? How did they argue their claim? But that's the hierarchy. And God, of course, is there. God is above everybody else. That is the ecclesiastical hierarchy. An administrative structure, originally kind of set up by Diocletian and the Roman government and the Roman Empire, that Christianity took over. And when Roman administrative structures in the West receded, the skeletal structure remained. It became an ecclesiastical structure of bishoprics and parishes and dioceses and archdioceses, and the Bishop of Rome at the top of it all. That's what we're talking about, Christendom and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. I'll come back more to the power thereof and what that power was based on. But then let's then switch and look at the other side, the lay hierarchy, which we have here in the next slide, is the lay hierarchy. Here we see God, then the emperor, then the kings, dukes, counts, and margraves, and then knights, and then the people. A very similar structure. The emperor viewed himself as ruling for God. Kings ruled themselves or view themselves as ruling for God. So there was a tension there at times between kings, important major kings like the King of France, or the King of England, and the emperor. Because if I am King of France, yes, I rule for God. If we look at the coronation ceremonies of the kings of France, which we have, they're filled with this theological ritualized rhetoric of the king is ruling for God. The King of France was the successor of Charlemagne, and yet the emperor was the successor of Charlemagne. We're going to see that conflict in the next lecture and the origins of that. But this is just the mental structure. Theoretically, the King of France was underneath the emperor. But then within the Kingdom of France, there were dukes and counts, etc. And then we get down to the level of the individual knights, individual manors, and then just the common people. So once again, this hierarchy, and it's a parallel hierarchy with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. If you were a king of France, you're going to be at a level at least of an archbishop, if not more so. A couple of archbishops, maybe. If you're the emperor, you're on the level of the pope. If you are a knight, or even a steward of a manor, the lord of the manor, you're in the level of a local parish. And everyone fit into this structure. Now, you can see how this would conflict, I would hope. The idea was, though, that both the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy, and just for simplicity's sake, the papal side of things and the imperial side of things, both had their own power. They both had a sword. And this gets to the power of the two swords, which comes from the Gospel of Luke. Two swords, that's enough, Jesus says. This became known as the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. We'll be talking about what that meant later on. But there is this conflict of power between these two sides. Now, the two-sword image was one of other images that were used. An early version, called the Gelasian version from Pope Gelasius, argued that the spiritual power was the sun and the temporal power was the moon, whereby the temporal power simply reflected the spiritual power. Does the Pope work for the emperor, or does the emperor work for the Pope, so to speak? That's what was getting at. If we look at this then structure in this next slide, this is still part of the conflict of hierarchies. Conflict of power. We have the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy put side by side. That's just all that this slide is, this next slide is, which I've already seen individually, but you can see the conflict there because the lines cross, and especially when we realize that there were nobles who became archbishops and bishops. So it's not that the ecclesiastical hierarchy was made up of, you know, a different type of person than the lay hierarchy. They're often one and the same. Popes too were often from noble families. So if I'm emperor, if my brother can be pope, great. Then we can work together. And if I'm king of France or of England, if I can have my cousins or whatever as archbishops and bishops, all the better. And so it's not it's an intermingling of these two hierarchies, and then how do we understand their respective powers and who has the final say? So there's going to be conflicts there. That's what we have to understand, this understanding of the power structures of Christendom were inherently ones of tension and conflict. And this has nothing to do with church and state. It's ecclesiastical power and lay power, the two swords, which everybody admitted. Everybody said, yes, there are two swords. There's the spiritual power and the temporal power. Spiritual power and temporal power is the ecclesiastical power and the lay power. Same thing. The papal and the imperial side of governing Christendom, which is a Christian empire, the Imperium Christianum. That's part of the tension of Rome having become Christian. It's not just a religion within an empire, it is the empire itself. But then who rules the empire? Well, God does. Everybody would agree with that. And everybody would agree that there are, the spiritual side of things, of course, and the temporal side of things, of course. How do they interact? How do they interact? That's the big question. And this then brings us to looking at the spiritual power and temporal power. Looked at the two hierarchies, but what was the source of those powers? And we're going to start with the spiritual power, because in some ways that is a bit more difficult. The temporal power is more easily understood. It is, I have an army, I have, fighters, I'm a warrior, and I can make you do something, and if you don't, I'll chop you up into pieces. Because you're not being obedient. I'll come back to that in a second. But what is the spiritual power, and how is that distinguished from the temporal power? Yeah. What was the spiritual sword? The sacraments. And here I have the slide: the spiritual power, the sacramental system. If we went to look at the Middle Ages, medieval Christendom, as a quote unquote age of faith, there is a reality to that. Because the entire basis of the spiritual power, the spiritual sword, was belief. Belief in heaven and hell. Because heaven and hell were at stake. Are you going to end up in heaven, or are you going to end up in hell? I don't want to be in hell. Hell's not nice. We'll be talking about that too, and descriptions of hell, and talks about hell, and visions of hell. Because it's scary. And the problem about hell is it never stops. It goes on forever and ever and ever and ever of eternal punishment and pain and suffering, more than we can imagine. So, it makes logical sense that you would do whatever it took to avoid hell. So the issue is, to avoid hell, how do I get into heaven? That's the problem. Can I get into heaven if I don't obey the Pope? Can I get to heaven if I don't do what my parish priest tells me to? Can't I earn my own way into heaven? Well, that question was already solved, so to speak, by Augustine, in the conflict with Pelagius in 418 CE, when the Pelagian position of we can be perfect was condemned. Augustine's position was that no, we cannot be perfect. We are all worthy of damnation. After the fall, we are all worthy of damnation. The question is, how do we escape that? It's only God's mercy and grace that allows us to escape hell. So, how do we get God's grace? Talk about that again as we get through the High and later Middle Ages and the developments of these ideas. But here, too, the essential position was God has provided means of grace for us. Now, after 418, after Augustine and after Pelagianism was condemned, no one would have said, I'm a Pelagian. I believe that we earn our salvation and we're worthy of it and we merit it. Damn it. So when we go up to, and die and stand before St. Peter, we can say, I've been good. Let me in. But people say, wait a minute. Grace. Has God deemed you worthy? Or are you proclaiming yourself worthy? Because that doesn't mean anything. God has to proclaim you worthy for heaven. How does God do that? Well, have you partaken of the means of grace that God in His mercy has offered and made available to people so that they can be saved? And what are those means of grace? The sacraments. So here, this is where the sacramental system becomes central for the entire understanding of Christendom, based on their belief, their faith, that yes, this was the way it was. It's only then in the Reformation in the 16th century that then this system, sacramental system, begins to be questioned. And that's from B354. Now, from early on, the sacraments were defined as, a means of grace, a means of salvation. That we received grace by receiving and participating in the sacraments. What are the sacraments? Well, there's a list of 7. There on the slide for you: baptism, confession, confirmation, Eucharist, ordination, marriage, and last rites or extreme unction. This enumeration of 7 sacraments was not established until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Before 1215, I'll be talking more about the Fourth Lateran Council when we get there. Before 1215, there were debates about how many sacraments were there. There's a distinction between a sacrament and a sacramental. I think it's to be kind of confusing. But what was a sacrament and what was a sacramental? Were there 8 sacraments? Were there 5 sacraments? It all becomes very unclear because the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper and baptism seem to be undeniably required by Scripture. The others, maybe not so much. The point is, too, at least theoretically, of the 7 sacraments, you can only participate or receive 6 of them. Because either you are ordained to the clergy and not married, or you are married and can't be ordained. We'll be coming back to that because there's an issue there. And there are exceptions, too, where you have widows or widowers who become ordained after their wife has died. But theoretically, that's the way it all kind of worked. And you can see, too, it goes from birth to death. The sacramental system was there with you at every stage of your life. The Eucharist and confession could be repeated. Nothing else could. Confession, absolution, because confession gets to be complex. The sacrament of confession is also the sacrament of absolution, which also means that you have to do penance. I'll be talking more about this later. Penance to receive absolution for your sins, and what's not sins that aren't confessed and forgiven, absolved, will come back to bite you, so to speak. I'll be talking about that too. We have not just heaven and hell, but the so-called discovery of purgatory in the 12th century, late 12th century, 1175. We have a third place in the afterlife. I'll get there when I get there, but here the concept is okay. These are all necessary. And your soul actually receives grace. I'll be talking about later too, the later Middle Ages, the economy of salvation, because it becomes very quantified in terms of the amount of grace in the prayer, the Hail Mary, the Ave Maria. It's Hail Mary, full of grace. What does it mean to be full of grace? Mary was full of grace. No one else is. Jesus didn't need grace because he is grace. But the rest of us are not full of grace. But how can we become as full of grace as we possibly can be? That is through the receiving of the sacraments. The last rites could also be repeated in cases of necessity. Meaning, if it was clear, seemed to be clear that someone was on their deathbed and about to die, they could receive last rites or extreme unction. But then they recovered and lived on, they could receive it again. But it was not supposed to be repeated. The other sacraments could not be repeated. It was sacrilegious, it was blasphemous, because what happens in a sacrament? God works in the sacrament, not the priest. That goes back to the Donatist controversy also in Augustine. It's not the work of the priest. The priest does not confer grace. God confers grace through the instrument of the priest in celebrating the sacraments. And yet, one thing that's going to be very important for our understanding of this whole system, sacrament of ordination. Because the sacrament of ordination changed your soul. All the other sacraments affected your soul, but ordination changed it. If you were ordained to the priesthood, your soul was imprinted. That's what it really was, imprinted as a stamp in clay. That stamp, that impression was called a character. A character is the Latin of our term character. What is your character? And there's other uses of the English word character too, which is also in the Latin as well. A caricature of an individual thing, or a joke, a caricature of. But here, the caricature was the impression of a seal in wax. And that's what happens in ordinations. It affects your soul, and it can never be redone. You can be defrocked, but you can never be unordained, because there is a distinction between the power of ordination and the power of jurisdiction. A priest had jurisdiction over the parish. Bishop had jurisdiction over a diocese. An archbishop had jurisdiction over the archdiocese. The Pope had jurisdiction over the whole thing. And this is kind of a later development in theory, but this is kind of implicitly there behind it all before. And that was not the case for the lay hierarchy. Only the ordained could affect the sacraments. I said it's not the work of the priest. It's not, but yet it is only through the vessels of the ordained does God work in the sacraments. Now, what this means is, too, and later on was formulated explicitly in this way, your simple parish priest could go and celebrate Mass. And what did that mean? That meant that Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, was physically present in the bread and the wine at consecration. The bread and the wine in the Eucharist, which was at every Mass, became the physical, real body and blood of Christ. Wow. We'll be talking more about that later on as we go. That's an awesome thing, scary thing. So the priest is making God present. Now, I'll be talking about later too. In terms of saying the Latin Mass, as I talked about in terms of the proprietary church, you had to get the basic formulas right. But your grammar didn't have to be perfect or anything. I'll be talking more about that. So the point is that a parish priest, a local parish priest, a local priest in a village on a manor could go in, screw up the Latin grammatically, but still God would be present. The emperor himself could go behind the altar, celebrate Mass, say all the words perfectly, and nothing would happen. There would be no transubstantiation. Now, transubstantiation, too, was a doctrine that was only defined at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which I'll be coming back to. But the concept and the debates were there from early on. What does happen in the Eucharist? What are the elements? After that definition that they are the real, true physical body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation, then the theories and power structures and implications of that began worked out in the political theory from the 13th century through the 14th century and beyond. Before that time, it's somewhat unclear, but there was never a time when the emperor was seen as able to affect and celebrate the Mass. There had to be a priest. That is a power that the emperor could not have. Absolution. Now, baptism, theoretically, a layperson could perform baptism. If there was an extreme necessity, if you were out somewhere traveling, let's say, and your wife gives birth, and there's no one around, you can't get to a priest or a church in time, one of you could baptize the baby, especially if the baby was showing signs of maybe not surviving. Because an unbaptized baby would go to hell. We'll be talking more about that later too. There's all kinds of ways to get around that too, but in the theory, from Augustine on, a unbaptized baby would go to hell. That's very clear. The scriptures say, "What did you need to do to be saved? Be baptized and follow me," says Jesus. Therefore, if you're not baptized, you're not going to be saved. Now, we have always the issue of the thief on the cross. Oh my God, what do we do with this? Because the thief on the cross wasn't baptized, and yet Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise, I tell you." So there are issues there, conflicts there, so to speak. And we're talking more about that too later on in terms of the development of how to deal with those conflicts. Gets into the issue between God's absolute power and his ordained power, blah, 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 blah. But the point here is that the whole basis of the power of the clergy was based on the sacraments as the means of grace. Because what could the clergy do? At least the bishops. Parish priests really couldn't do this because it gets into more technical things, how a bishop is a perfected priest. Not that any bishop is perfect in any way, shape, or form, but a bishop can do things that a parish priest cannot. A parish priest cannot ordain people. Only a bishop or archbishop can ordain people. A parish priest cannot consecrate a new church. Only a bishop can consecrate a new church, etc. And only a bishop can excommunicate you. What does excommunication mean? It means being cut off from the sacraments. excommunicate, taking out of the communion, that communio fidelium that I talked about as being the basic foundation of the church. Excommunication was like you are no longer part of the communio fidelium. You're no longer part of the church. You're no longer part of the group that is following Christ. You are then outside of that, and therefore you are going to hell. That was the spiritual sword, the power of excommunication to prevent people from being able to partake of the sacraments. And we're going to see the implications of that after the first midterm, because that's a huge issue. But the point is, if I'm a bishop or I'm the pope and say you're excommunicated, if I'm the emperor, what if I say, so what? No, I'm not, because I'm God's appointed servant. And you are illegitimately trying to excommunicate me. We will see that conflict with Emperor Gregory the Seventh. Pope Gregory the Seventh, Emperor Henry the Fourth, early on after the midterm, because this is based on unbelief. There's all kinds of politics involved too, which I'll be talking about as we go through things in this development after this first midterm. But that, in terms of the age of faith, is based on that belief of heaven and hell and of the sacraments as means of grace that were necessary to get to heaven. And if you were excommunicated, that meant basically you're going to hell. Or at least after 1175 with the discovery, invention of purgatory. If you're excommunicated, you're going to spend a lot of time in purgatory, which also was not pleasant. Okay, we'll get there when we get there. We're talking about structures of belief. Call it ideology, call it whatever you want. It's the myth of Christendom. That's what we're getting at, because this was something that everybody bought into. The issue was, what did it mean? That was what the conflict was about. And the spiritual sword, the spiritual power, was based on the sacraments as means of grace necessary for salvation, and the ability of the clergy using the spiritual sword to cut people off from that. Now, they were supposed to be not, supposed to interfere with the temporal sword, because what was the temporal sword was the actual military fighting. No, we'll see, as I've already mentioned, the popes did go to war, etc. But they weren't supposed to, theoretically. That's also part of the conflict later on, because the bishop or the pope was not to interfere within temporal affairs, was not to interfere with the use of the temporal sword, even though the temporal sword was to be used for the spiritual sword, supposedly. And we'll see how that all works out later. But the point being here is sin. Because sin was part of the spiritual power to absolve sins. It's confession, absolution. In causa peccati, in the case of sin, the spiritual power was supreme. But the emperor might say, yeah, so what, spiritual power, fine. I'm still going to go invade England. But if the Pope says, no, you cannot, because that would be a sin, and if you do, I will excommunicate you. Is that interfering in temporal affairs, or is that just exercising the spiritual sword for spiritual affairs? This body soul issue, how do we extract body and soul? It's almost impossible. There are distinctions we can make. Meaning, if I'm fighting for my prince and I lose an arm that's part of my body, that's nothing compared to losing my soul. How do we deal with that problem? this gets at some of the conflicts there. It's all based on salvation and damnation. Temporal powers, I've already said, is the actual power, physical military power that were supposed to be wielded by the laity. The spiritual power, the spiritual sword, was supposed to be wielded by the clergy, especially the bishops and on up, higher up on the hierarchy. Now, a priest could prevent you from receiving communion, but an individual parish priest could not excommunicate you. So there's still some coercion there. It's a different type of coercion than the temporal power with the temporal sword, because no bishop could put a sword to your throat and say you were going to follow what I say. The emperor could do that, princes could do that, but not the bishops or the priests. But they could say, you're excommunicated, the bishops could, and therefore you're going to hell. Ha, that's my spiritual sword. That gets at this issue of the conflict. How do we go about understanding who wields the swords and how are they wielded for what purpose and what power? And if there's a conflict, who has the final say? That's the whole issue of Christendom. Even though both bought into it, both sides, the laity and the ecclesiastical side of things, everyone agreed basically. Again, except for the Muslims who are not part of Christendom, and the Jews who are within Christendom but are just Jews. I should say just Jews. There is always this tension between Christendom and the Jews, and we'll talk about that too as we get also into the later Middle Ages. The relationship between the two. That's kind of a separate issue. But this inherent conflict over how do we govern ourselves? How should the Imperium Christianum, the Christian empire, be governed? Who has the say? Now, temporal and spiritual I have up there, this inherent conflict based on the sacramental system. And then the proprietary church, if I'm a prince, if I'm a knight, if I'm a lord of the manor, if I'm a king, the church is my church. I'm in charge of it. I'm responsible for it. I'm responsible for the spiritual and physical well-being, or I should say the physical and spiritual well-being of my subjects. How do I go about doing that? But yeah, if I'm a priest or a bishop, I'm responsible. And the Pope, I'm responsible for everything. I have jurisdiction over the entire church, says the Pope. And I'm going to have to answer to God. Are these inherent conflicts resolved? They basically weren't. They just remained conflictual within this structure, this operating systems that I kind of referred to, this ideology of Christendom, this myth of Christendom. It's a myth because it was never this harmonious whole, even though that was the idea, that was the ideal. We're supposed to be working together. There'll be times when seemingly they did work together. That's in the Crusades. We'll be talking about that too after the midterm. But for the most part, there's always an inherent tension that could be unresolved. So in many ways, this conflict, this inherent conflict, also based on the overlaps with the nobility becoming bishops, etc. And later on was talked about in the empire, the prince bishops. So there's this inherent conflict of understandings about how this all worked. It seems to us at times contradictory, and that the political context of medieval Christendom was just a series of contradictions. But that would be to misunderstand it. That would be to put it into this context of state and church. And that would be imposing a modern understanding of the structure onto the medieval past. Whereas for them, there was no contradiction. Conflicts, yes, but not a contradiction. We'll see this again and again and again. But what to us seems to be a contradiction was for them just the way it was, without a contradiction, even if there could be conflict. But it's understanding the structure of these competing power structures is essential for understanding Christendom. And Christendom as a concept is essential for understanding the Middle Ages. That's what I hope you can come to see. And it's necessary for us to understand the developments that we will be seeing after the midterm in terms of the transition and evolving of the Middle Ages into what we call the High and Late Middle Ages. That's what this is all about. Thank you so much. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.